Hi, this is Paul, and I did a bunch of videos last week because I didn't have a sermon to write, and I do have a sermon to write this week, and I also have a bunch of conversations with some other YouTubers this week that I'm doing. I just recorded one with Jonathan Pajot, and I thought we hit it off really well, and we had a great time together. And Jonathan's gonna post it on his channel, so when it's posted, I'll leave a link or I'll figure out how to do that somehow. But we really, I thought we had a terrific conversation this morning, so look forward to watching that if you're interested. I didn't make any videos this weekend. Yesterday was a holiday in California, so I spent it with my family. We actually were cleaning the house, so that's just time for spring cleaning. But last night, or this morning, I saw this piece on AltNet. The right's favorite new intellectual has found some truly pitiable ideas about masculinity. Why does anyone take Jordan Peterson seriously? Oh my goodness. Why does anyone take Jordan Peterson seriously? He talks about some guy, Mansfield was by no means the first fusty old professor to grouse about women troubles. Men like him have been grumbling since before women's studies made a beachhead at San Diego State in the early 70s. And on and on. And the decade or so since has seen the emergence of self-proclaimed counter-revolution to the conjoined scourges of gay rights, feminism, and preferred pronouns. It includes elbow-patched academic self-proclaims, men's rights activists, and victims and vitamin scammers of the so-called alt-right. It includes Jordan Peterson. Dum dum dum. I thought of Kern's question when I took the tentative dip into Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. And on he goes about that. Devotees of pseudoscience of evolutionary psychology are fond of this particular maneuver. Locate some behavior in the more ancient branches of the tree of life and project it forward across eons to explain little Johnny pulling little Susie's pigtails, or the collapse of Lehman Brothers, or the Holocaust, or whatever. In any case, I can imagine the diaphanous energy-based extraterrestrials in their invisible starships so utterly alien that they gaze upon man and lobster and cannot tell them apart. Now, there have been a whole bunch of hit jobs on Peterson since his book has come out. And again, this gets into my ongoing ponderings about the difference between YouTube and the printed page. And what I noticed about this piece was that the comments, many of whom were also critical of Peterson, hated this piece because all this guy does is give clever put downs. That's in fact the entire article. He doesn't contribute anything to the conversation. A professor of no particular scholarly distinction. I imagine this is Thurston Howell the Third, writing this. A professor of no particular scholarly distinction. His previous book was a mashup of Gladwellian pop neuroscience and Joseph Campbell's pop anthropology. Peterson chose to fame by getting angry about pronouns and now gives lectures on manly self-sufficiency to roomfuls of barely post-adolescent boys. I found a lot of buckos that are way past post-adolescence. Still smarting from the Sadie Hawkins dance. I imagine Richard Spencer were ghoulishly spliced with Susie Orman, and you'd get the idea. If I could watch one of the lectures, dozens of lectures, if I could watch one of the dozens of lectures he's posted on YouTube, or he's posted to YouTube for his frustrated young acolytes. I've been happily married for 30 years. I've been employed for decade after decade. My room isn't as clean as it could be, but it's functional. So, yeah. What really struck me about this piece was I think what CS Lewis would say. Now, I've been rereading Alan Jacobs' terrific book, The Narnian. And I had read this book about 10 years ago, and I've been rereading it and just I've been falling in love with this book all over again. I think it is some people have been asking me, well, what should I read? And I'll usually say, start with Mere Christianity. Classic, terrific book. And after you read Mere Christianity, I usually like to read something by an author first. And then second, I like to read something by probably a sympathetic biographer or commenter on that author. And so The Narnian would be a terrific second book to read if you're looking to get into C.S. Lewis, because Alan Jacobs, who I believe is a professor of English literature, also just does a tremendous job weaving a biography of Lewis together with a lot of the stuff of Lewis. And what struck me as I was watching this hit job on Peterson was C.S. Lewis's Chronological Snobbery. And so I want to read a little bit from the Narnian. Looking at the previous paragraph, one might easily imagine that the defense of old books and old ideas was for Lewis bound up quite tightly with some old beliefs, especially about God and the character of God's creation. His students could invariably say that he had never made any attempt to impose or even push his Christian belief in lectures or tutorials, but it could not have escaped Lewis's notice, or that of the more attentive students, that in laying the groundwork for an appreciation of medieval and Renaissance literature, he was also silently removing some of the impediments to an appreciation of the religion of those eras, which happened to be Christianity. Granted, The Problem of Pain is an openly Christian book rather than a university lecture, but Lewis employed the same rhetorical techniques in many different settings. And this is where we get into this. The great books of the past, then, if we read them properly and carefully, can be mirrors in which we see the sins and limitations of our own period. And perhaps once we see them, we can begin to remedy them. And this is Lewis's point, that we are all living in our own little bubble. And our own little bubble of our own experience. In my video I did about Locke imagined a human being as being in this camera obscura, this dark room, and the only light coming in are the 5 windows of the 5 senses. And Peterson deals with that with some of his psychology, and psychology has really pushed back hard on that type of perspective. But in a sense, what Lewis is saying here is that we live in a bubble of our own times. And we live in a sense in a sociological bubble. And so we don't actually engage with ideas of what someone is saying. We engage with a reputation. So if we hear that Peterson is alt-right, we can easily dismiss him as alt-right. And now on one hand, I don't want to be too hard on that, because there are a lot of people in the world and there are a lot of ideas in the world. And so we can't really know everything quickly, so we rely on these low resolution images, representations of people, to kind of decide who we're going to pay attention to and who we're going to dismiss. And that's absolutely appropriate when it comes to your own personal navigation. But if you're writing an article on someone, and I'm guilty of this, I'm sure. If you go through my blog, I've been writing stuff for 10 years. I'm sure I've dealt with people irresponsibly and uncharitably in the past. But an editor should pay attention to something like this. And so a hit piece like a lot of the ones that we've seen, it's almost like the Kathy Newman interview and Peterson's response to it. Well, you're talking to someone, it's just not him. And so, yeah, do a little hit piece and be clever. But Lewis gets to the point of, well, we're living in our own little bubble. If you really want to learn something about the world, you've got to get out of your bubble. And one of travel, you can do that now. Go and live in another country for a number of years. Go and live, even maybe stay in your own country and live in a community of a different racial or cultural or ethnic group than you were raised in, and learn that culture. Get to know other cultures. But Lewis makes the point that one of the best ways to get to know other cultures is to read old books and read books and study cultures that are very different from your own. And so Lewis basically said, we need in fact to read old books. In The Discarded Image, a book not published until after C.S. Lewis's death, but largely transcribed from the Prolegomena lectures, and I've talked about that word a little bit in some of my early Jordan Peterson videos. He described the outline of the medieval model of the universe, its structure, its inhabitants, its history, and then writes an epilogue. I have made no serious effort to hide the fact that the old model delights me as I believe it delighted our ancestors. Few constructions of the imagination seem to me to have combined splendor, sobriety, and coherence into the same degree. it is possible that some readers have long been itching to remind me that it has a serious defect. It is not, I agree, it was not true. Okay, now we're going to get into the idea of what we mean by true. But having acknowledged the point, Lewis insists that we are still not free to dismiss the model altogether, for which we know, thanks in part to the development of quantum physics, which reveals that the Newtonian laws that apply uniformly in the world visibly to us do not apply at all on the subatomic level, that our own model is not simply and straightforwardly true either. Our understanding of the natural world remains a model, or, in Peterson's words, a representation, not simply a collection of facts. We no longer dismiss this change of models as a simple progress from error to truth. No model is a catalog of ultimate realities and none a mere fantasy. In other words, when we talk about the Earth going around the sun, we're talking about a model. And that model is dependent upon a representation that places the observer in a particular point. And this is true of all of the stuff that we're doing. None of us can see the whole. And so this is part of the reason why I really appreciated Peterson and why he was so helpful in terms of really prompting some thinking about representations, and why Lewis is so helpful is because Lewis, for example, will say, okay, you read the ancients. Did they get a bunch of stuff wrong? Yes. Here's the problem with our bubble. We don't know what we have wrong. Well, how can we figure that out? Talk to Jonathan Haidt about diversity. What is diversity for? Diversity is to get another perspective so that we can do we can try and suss out errors. That is why diversity is helpful. And this is why diversity is important also in terms of thought. So we look at our model, which we believe in, because we got to believe in something, and we test it against other models. Well, what about our culture? What about our perspective of the world? What about our perspective on religion? Well, pluralism is really helpful because it gives us other things with which to test it. But just because we recognize in the past, for example, that they got some things wrong, it doesn't mean that we're getting everything right. And so find what they got right can maybe help us figure out what we're getting wrong. Lewis is certainly not saying here that the shift of believing that the sun revolves around the earth to the belief that the earth revolves around the sun is mere social construction, subject to revision when intellectual fashions change. Rather, he is saying that when we reject the geocentrism, we rejected a lot of other beliefs as well because they became part of that model. Not all of those beliefs had been disproven in the way that geocentrism was. And actually, in my talk with Jonathan Pajot, we talked a little bit about this. And we're both kind of on the same page in terms of, well, yeah, we certainly believe that the present scientific model of how the Earth and the Sun and the Moon, for example, relate, and Mars and the other planets is a far better tool for figuring out how to put a man on the moon. Absolutely. We couldn't have done it with the Aristotelian spheres. Okay. But as I think Jonathan Pajot points out, phenomenologically, we do live on a flat Earth with a sky above. And so just because you can put someone on the moon doesn't mean, well, what it should mean is that we should have a little bit of sophistication with respect to our representations and the ways that these different representations are tools for understanding different aspects of ourselves. And Lewis got this, and at some point we're going to get to that conversation in his book Miracles as well. We tend to assume that if our ancestors were so wrong about that, they must have been equally wrong about everything else. And we go on to assume that anything we believe they must have disbelieved, which is certainly not true. So we hear that someone we call the medieval man thought that the world was flat, which is untrue. Or we say that our ancestors believed that the sun revolved around the earth because they naively and arrogantly assumed that they were the most important beings in the universe, which is also untrue. It turns out that it is a lot easier to keep believing what everyone else around us believes if we ignore or misrepresent the beliefs of our ancestors, or if we ignore or misrepresent the beliefs of our cultural adversaries or rivals. It's not only does it have issues with morality, not only is it a form of lying, but it diminishes us, because we have a less accurate picture of the world because we refuse to actually listen to our neighbor. And part of the problem with all of these hit pieces is that they are, well, in a sense, they're betraying an implicit trust that the purpose behind a critical engagement of a book is to illuminate the book and help the reader figure something out. Now, Lewis actually is going to go far deeper into this. In 1940, Lewis started writing a series of fictional letters from a demon named Screwtape to his pupil, a tempter in training named Wormwood. Does this infernal setting tell us what Lewis really thought about being a tutor? Well, this is a biographer asking a question. Lewis probably didn't like being a tutor very much. At least it tells us that the didactic role was one that came easily to him, even if he was turning it upside down for the purpose of his book, with good becoming bad and bad good. Our Heavenly Father is replaced by our Father below, the beatific vision that the Christian mystics seek, giving way to the miserific vision of the depths of hell and the devilish proprietor. Not all readers of The Guardian, the Anglican weekly in which the letters were originally published, got the joke. One clergyman wrote to cancel his subscription to the magazine on the grounds that the advice given by Wormwood was not only erroneous, but positively diabolical. And we talk about the literal internet today. Well, literalism wasn't invented by the internet, folks. It was alive and well in newspapers. Demons themselves were teachers of sorts, and in Screwtape's view, they had been very successful ones. He was especially proud of their ability to instruct their patients, as he called humans they were charged with tempting, in a system of thought whose prevalence made Lewis's job much harder. Screwtape calls the system the historical point of view. Only the learned read old books, he boasts to Wormwood, and we have now dealt with that learning, and we have now so dealt with the learned that they are of all men the least likely to acquire wisdom by doing so. What was Lewis saying? Lewis was saying that, well, PhD can sometimes mean piled high, why can't I say it? Basically piled higher, deeper, and deeper. It's the idea that a PhD is sometimes now someone who focuses so narrowly on a tiny little part of the world, and there's certainly benefit to that in terms of the world is so utterly rich and deep that we can focus on tiny little portions. But what is really helpful, and I think this is part of what Peterson's gift has been an integrated vision, to take all of this data and to try and bring it into a cohesive whole. And this, in fact, was one of the helpful things that the medieval picture, for all of its lacking, did in fact construct for people a multi-layered framework and worldview within which they could inhabit, unlike the rather fragmented nihilistic cultures that we have today that are, and I think Peterson gets this dead on right, so susceptible to ideologies. Because we can take one little idea, such as the right and the left, the good and the bad, and plaster that on everything and dismiss everything anyone says according to some tiny little, reduce them to some little straw man that can be easily dispatched. And Lewis calls this the historical point of view. And Lewis was actually railing against this stuff in the 40s and 50s, the 1940s and 50s. We have done this by inculcating the historical point of view, which put briefly means that when a learned man is presented with any statement from an ancient author, the one question he never asks is whether it's true. So, this pitiable version of men and women, well, you don't like it because it's old-fashioned in your mind. You think we have progressed beyond it. You think we should all all the really smart and important people think like you, and those who don't should perhaps be reprogrammed or scorned or marginalized because they're just simply not as smart as you and they can't put it together like you. Okay, that's the historical point of view. Instead, authors ask about who influenced this ancient writer, or whom this writer influenced. Describe how the learned man's own colleagues have misunderstood the author, and so on. To regard the ancient author as possible source of knowledge, to anticipate that what he said could possibly modify our own thoughts or behavior, this would be rejected as unutterably simple-minded. The historical point of view is one of the chief means by which we insulate ourselves from the possible wisdom of our ancestors. Another is the mode of thought that Lewis humorously calls Bullverism. And you can, if you Google Bullverism, you can find, in fact, a whole essay on this by Lewis. After his imaginary founder, Ezekiel Bulver, whose destiny was determined at the age of 5 when he heard his mother say to his father, who had been maintaining that two sides of a triangle were together greater than the third, "Oh, you say that because you are a man." At that moment, Ezekiel Bulver assures us, "There flashed across my opening mind the great truth that refutation is no necessary part of argument. Assume that your opponent is wrong, and then explain his error, and the world will be at your feet. Attempt to prove that he is wrong, or worse still, try to find out whether he is wrong or right, and the national dynamism of our age will thrust you to the wall." That is how Bulver became one of the makers of the 20th century. Now, we might look within our little temporal bubble at what's happening with Jordan Peterson and say, oh, this is all new. This isn't new. This is very old. And in fact, CS Lewis coined his term Bullverism to describe exactly what has been happening with Peterson and exactly what Peterson is complaining in the culture. Well, we can't listen to him because he's a man. We can't listen to her because she's a woman. We can't listen to him because he's a white man. He can't have anything to say because he's a black man. And we would have hoped that in the process of the civil rights movement, we would have gotten beyond this. But instead, here's an irony I thought of yesterday, in that, so you have, in a sense, Martin Luther King Jr. quoting Gandhi, quoting Tolstoy, going all the way back to Jesus, doing some critique of an eye for an eye. An eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. But what we do in terms of conversations with respect to race and gender and how many other things is we imagine that, another aphorism, turnabout is fair play. Well, if you want to stay ignorant, don't listen to people who are Christian or not Christian, or of a certain ethnic group, or of a certain university, or of a certain newspaper. Don't listen to anyone who isn't in your tribe, and you can stay in your comfortable little bubble. And dismiss everyone who isn't in your tribe for whatever reasons, because of their gender or whatnot. And then write pieces that very cleverly dispatch them without ever stopping and asking a question, is anything they're saying true, and how can we know it? And let's see if we can get to the bottom of it. In writings of this kind, Lewis produced an incisive critique of what Marxism calls ideology. Well, isn't this interesting? That is, the system of belief that is so taken for granted in a given culture that hardly anyone ever notices that they are beliefs. They are treated as unquestioned facts. Again, read what's his head's pitiable ideas about masculinity, or his ideas about Peterson's quote-unquote pitiable ideas, and we don't look at those ideas at all. Lewis was an exceptionally skillful exposer of ideological forces. Sound familiar? And their titanic influence over us. But he rarely gets credit for this from contemporary intellectuals because of their most treasured beliefs that, more often than not, he is exposing. So instead of praising him for the acuity of his insights, they call him reactionary or Victorian, or Peterson gets called alt-right. precisely the sorts of things that Bullverists and chronological snobs are bound to call him given their premises. For to say that someone is reactionary or Victorian is to say nothing about the validity, the truthfulness of the positions he or she takes, and indeed, this is the diabolical purpose of Bullverism and the historical point of view, to remove questions of truth and falsehood from the mind's eye. This, in Lewis's Screwtape letters, is exactly what the demons always do, and how, in a sense, the demons keep people perfectly captured within their own ideologies and let them floating along comfortably in their own ideologies until, as in Lewis's story, they go down to hell, where they get, well, I think Lewis takes it both ways, because if you read Lewis's The Great Divorce, what happens that people who are victims and prisoners of ideologies, they never escape their ideologies, and their ideologies themselves become hell. For example, in Lewis and the Great Divorce, someone who grumbles all the time soon loses their personhood and themselves becomes merely a grumble. Someone who, let's say, takes on a cultural identity, increasingly making that their only identity, loses in fact their individuality. And this is precisely the point that Peterson makes in terms of his individualism, but Lewis was making this point in the 1940s. In the very first letter to his nephew, Screwtape reminds Wormwood that his patient doesn't think of doctrines as primarily true or false, but as academic or practical, outworn, contemporary, conventional, or ruthless. Jargon, not argument, is your best ally in keeping him from church. And in fact, part of the problem with churches, as many of the commenters have said, is that they are lost. Churches get lost in their own jargon, in their own cliches, in their own little forms of speaking. And for all the talk that churches like to do about truth, churches sometimes don't bother to have conversations about real truth, which is in fact what this whole thing is about. Don't waste time trying to make him think that materialism is true. Make him think that it is strong or stark or courageous, that it is the philosophy of the future. How many times haven't we heard in the last few years that, this is the people of the future will judge you for not getting on board with this. Well, let's read a little history and imagine what we might be judged for from the people of the future today. And probably the best chance of seeing that is, in fact, to look at different cultures and, in fact, read history and look into the past. That is the sort of thing he cares about, and the sort of thing Screwtape insists he needs to think about. Screwtape is proud of the inroads this indifference to truth has made into the church itself. Only today I have found a passage in a Christian writer where he recommends his own version of Christianity on the ground that only such a faith can outlast the death of old cultures and the birth of new civilizations. You see the little rift? Believe this, not because it's true, but for some other reason. That's the game. So, that's what I wanted to point out this morning. The little hit pieces are all alike. And again, in this moment, if all we know is this little moment, we think, oh, Jordan Peterson is doing something new. And, well, it might be new for us. But again, this is remarkably similar. Now, there's a lot of differences between Peterson and Lewis, but it's remarkably similar to the project that Lewis had in the 1940s and 50s. And those of us who really love CS Lewis, I look at Jordan Peterson and I think, just like this one article, that was done by this guy from Hillsdale. Now I don't remember his name. See, I should do my homework better and prepare these videos better. I should clean up my own room. But Lewis, Peterson, there's a lot in common going on between these two. So there's some initial thoughts for the beginning of the week. And you'll definitely hear more from me this week. If it's not just me, it'll be me in conversations with some other YouTubers, and I'm also planning a conversation with someone who isn't on YouTube, but someone in the Netherlands. So stay tuned.